Land for the landless. With just those 4 words, the Philippine Supreme Court kicked off one of its most important decisions ever. It really captures a struggle that's been a part of the nation's history for a very, very long time. It's a powerful phrase, and it perfectly sets the stage for this whole saga of promises, protests, and a massive legal battle. And that brings us to the big question we're tackling in this explainer. What happens when, instead of getting a deed to your own piece of land, you're offered a piece of the company that owns it? Can a stock certificate really replace a plot of soil? That's the innovative and, yeah, deeply controversial idea we're about to get into. The case at the very heart of all this is the landmark Supreme Court ruling on Hacienda Luisita. It's a decision that has completely shaped the conversation around land reform in the Philippines for years now. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dig into the really deep history of this dispute. Then we'll explore the unique stock for land swap that was put on the table. After that, we'll see how the promises of that deal kind of crashed into reality, which led to the government stepping in, and finally, the Supreme Court having the last word. All right, first up, a land dispute that's been brewing for decades. And this entire story revolves around one place, Hacienda Luisita, a huge sugar plantation in Tarlac. The roots of this thing go way, way back. It all gets started in 1957 when a company called Tadeko, owned by the Corjunco family, buys the hacienda with some help from the government. Now, over the next 30 years or so, land reform laws are changing, and it all leads to this huge moment in 1988. A new law's passed, and it introduces a totally new idea that changes everything, the stock distribution option. But here's the absolute key, the one thing you have to remember from all this history. That government loan back in '57, it came with a massive condition that the land would, eventually, be distributed to the people who actually worked it. That single promise would hang over everything for the next 50 years. So you have this huge promise to give out land, but you also want to keep this massive plantation running as one big, efficient farm. How do you do both? Well, that question leads us right into our next section, the stock for land swap. So there were 2 very different ways this could go. The traditional way is direct land distribution. Think of it like this. You get your own slice of the pizza. Simple, right? But this new law allowed for something called a stock distribution option, or SDO. And with the SDO, instead of getting a slice, you get shares in the entire pizza parlor. You don't own the oven or a table, but you become a part owner of the whole business. So to make this SDO happen, a whole new company was created, Hacienda Luisita Incorporated, or HLI for short. The farm workers' share was figured out by looking at the value of the farmland compared to everything else the company owned. And it worked out to about 1/3 of the company, or 33.3% of the shares. So what does that 1/3 stake actually look like? Well, it's a huge number, over 118 million shares of stock. And these were supposed to be given out, for free, to nearly 6,300 farm workers. But here's the catch. It wasn't going to happen overnight. It was going to be spread out over 30 years. So this was the deal on the table in 1989. In exchange for not getting a physical piece of land, the farm workers were promised some specific things. Those free shares over 30 years, a 3% cut of the gross sales every single year, a seat on the board of directors, and a free residential plot for every family. I mean, on paper, it looks pretty comprehensive. But, what's written down on paper and what happens in real life, well, those can be 2 very different things. As we'll see in our next section, after more than a decade, the whole deal started to fall apart. And that breaking point finally came in 2003. It wasn't just a few people. 2 different groups of farm workers, representing a huge chunk of the original beneficiaries, took action. They went to the government, to the Department of Agrarian Reform, and they officially asked for the stock agreement to be canceled. So you might be asking, what exactly went wrong? Well, the farm workers had a whole list of problems. They said their lives just hadn't gotten any better like they were promised. They weren't getting dividends from the company's profits. Then they felt totally betrayed when the company sold off a massive 500-hectare piece of the hacienda for industrial development. They also said the way shares were being handed out was unfair. And to top it all off, many of them still hadn't gotten the titles to their home lots. The promise and the reality were worlds apart. With these petitions on the table, the government had to step in. The Department of Agrarian Reform, or DAR, was now officially on the case, and they launched a full investigation. And the government didn't just jump in. They had a process. First, DARA put together a special task force. That task force looked into everything and came to a conclusion. HLI had not lived up to its end of the bargain. Those findings then went up to the Presidential Agrarian Reform Council, or PARC, which is the highest body for this stuff in the country. And finally, in 2005, PARC made it official. They canceled the stock deal and ordered the land to be distributed.
Of course, HLI wasn't just going to accept that. They challenged the decision, and the case started climbing all the way up the legal ladder, right to the top. Which brings us to the final act, the Supreme Court's final word. So the Supreme Court gets this case, and the first huge question they had to answer was pretty fundamental. Is this whole idea of giving out stock instead of land even legal under the Constitution? And this is where things get really interesting. The court's answer was no. They said the stock distribution option itself is perfectly constitutional. Why? Because the Philippine Constitution says farmers can own land directly or collectively. And the court decided that collectively could absolutely mean owning land through shares in a corporation. Okay, so wait a minute. If the whole idea was legal, then why did the Supreme Court still agree with the government and cancel this specific agreement? It seems a bit contradictory, right? Well, it all came down to how the plan was actually carried out. The problem wasn't the what, it was the how. The Supreme Court found two major violations. First, the way shares were handed out. It was based on how many days a person worked, which meant some got more than others. The rules said it had to be equal. Second, that 30-year timeline for distributing the shares, that was a huge problem. The regulations back then required a plan like this to be done within just 3 months. Okay, but there's one more loose end, right? What about that huge chunk of land, the 500 hectares that had already been sold off? To figure that out, we need to quickly understand a legal term, an innocent purchaser for value. Basically, it's someone who buys property honestly, paying a fair price, without knowing someone else has a claim on it. At the end of the day, the court looked at the companies that bought that land and said, look, they're innocent purchasers. Since the land had been officially rezoned by the government and sold legally, the court ruled that unfortunately those parts of the Hacienda couldn't be taken back and given to the farmers. And all of this, it brings us right back to where we started, but with a much deeper question. The Hacienda Luisita case proved that collective ownership can be a valid path, but it also showed just how badly a plan like that can fail if it's not done right. So it leaves us all wondering, is just handing over a piece of paper, a title to land, enough to guarantee success for farmers? Or are there other, maybe more creative, more complex ways to achieve agrarian justice that we just haven't even explored yet?